Hey guys, I'm Scott Schneider. This is Stereo Niche. This week we're going to talk about the early 60s tube era. Stick around. All right, so it's winter time. It's when I like to break out some of the tube gear. And this week I thought I would do that with the first tube piece that actually I ever bought. And this is a Fisher X-101-B, and it comes from 1961. Now, interesting story. I bought this very early on when I started getting into vintage audio. And it was one of these situations where I found out that there was an old stereo being advertised, and literally it was a picture in this a very blurry picture in this very old looking sort of console. I'll say cabinet. It wasn't a console system; it was a cabinet, and I could tell it was a realistic receiver. And there were some other older components around it, and so I knew enough to know that I was interested. So I reached out to them and asked to come over and take a look at it. They said, sure. I came over, ended up, the receiver was a very nice, realistic STA 2100D, the biggest one they made. But while I'm checking things out in this cabinet, I happened to notice that there was a little dial mounted, just a small little dial mounted separately to the cabinet itself, and it said Fisher on it. And it said Fisher Space Expander, to be honest. And so I knew at that point that at least at one point in time, there was a Fisher tube gear, there was some tube gear in this particular cabinet. So naturally I said, well, are there any other pieces? And they said, well, we're still going through the attic, but we think there are probably some pieces there. So I said, well, I would love to find those, and I'd be interested in them. And they were game about going up there and digging through some things. So there we went. And literally it was one of these where you couldn't stand up in this attic. It was very tight. And as I remember, sort of the son, I think, who was in his teens, went up there and was handing things to me, etc. And he found some things with Fisher on them, like I suspected. Turned out it was the integrated amp here and a tuner. And a couple of other things. I think there was some reel-to-reel bits there. But they were all packed up very nicely, and they had been there based on the newspaper. I think they were put there sometime in the 80s. And so been there a very long time. So we made a deal. I took them home and was just thrilled. This is the integrated amp from that set, and it has been fully recapped, in case anyone's wondering right off the bat. So it's been fully recapped, and it's just a beautiful little unit. So this era is the 1960s, right? So it's right after the advent of stereo. Now, stereo came out in 1958, but it didn't take off right away. Not everyone didn't go out and get rid of their mono systems. It took some time for people to migrate into stereo. And so these units from about 1959, 60, 61, 62, they were still transitioning and setting them up. So if you had mono systems, you could still use the systems that were being put together. So there's some interesting features that I'll go through in the next segment, but that's the time frame. Stereo back then, if you didn't have a stereo system, sometimes for some stations, they were broadcasting stereo over the AM channel and the FM channel. So you'd have to actually tune in both of those to get actual stereo. So it was quite an interesting period of time for several years as people, slowly transitioned over. So systems like this have these interesting features so that they can accommodate those. So for me, Fisher and Scott and Heath and other companies, Citation, Hardin Carman, they were sort of, it was the peak of the tube era. And as the technology got better and better, the amplification and these receivers and all of that there were numerous models and it's all different levels of output, and it was quite an exciting time for the tube era. So Fisher, as one example, they were advertising multiple models. If you can see in this advertisement, all the different models that were available at that time: the Fisher 800B, the FM tuners, the FM 1000, very hard to find, by the way. They had MPX multiplexers that you could add, to these to make it stereo if it was a mono system. So they had different devices where you could add and add stereo to it, upgrade. The Fisher X-202, at 75 watts. The Fisher X-100 here, an audio control at 36 watts. So they had a gamut of offerings here at all these different price points that they were trying to fulfill the market here. And so there was a lot of demand for different things. I think it's really interesting that the 400CX here, the preamp, I'm sure it was meant really to be paired with this SA300B, the separate amplifier, standalone. So all of these were being offered, in addition to this X-101. This particular ad, by the way, the X-101-B here that's being added, this was the main ad, and then they showed all these other offerings and down below it. But this was the X-101-B. It was 56 watts, the master control amplifier. And I find, the interesting, some of the things it denotes here in the advertisement. It's easily the most powerful and versatile master control amplifier in its range. So, really building this thing up. But one of the things that caught my eye, and I can't remember exactly where it was, but it mentions it has 14 inputs to be very flexible and forward compatible with, wherever the technology may go. I can't figure out how they came up with 14 inputs to save my life here, but it's quite a number. I tried to add up all the individual mono connections, etc., but I think about the most I could come up with was about 11, and that's stretching it. So it was a quite interesting advertisement. Let's see, it has 3 speaker outputs. That includes a center channel, by the way. 4 outputs, 4 associated components, easy to connect. You're complete and guaranteed against obsolescence. So, a lot of, I think, exciting conversation going on in the hi-fi community, and people were really getting excited about stereo and all this live per se music at home, and the sort of the early days of hi-fi. And it was, I think, looking at the advertisement, it's pretty funny. There is in this one of the older editions of I think it was a Stereo Review. I pulled this up. It was from 1961. But they had this article that they were talking about. This was a future article, and they were talking about how did people listen to music 60 years earlier. Now, this is 1961, so they're talking about right at the 1900, and how difficult might it have been for the listener to comprehend the music from Stravinsky and Schoenberg, based on, I guess, listening to it on an Edison-type player. And they thought that music of the 60s had become extremely complex, and how might it be in the future? And they made a comment here that they were going to originally talk about the 2020s, 60 years later, but they thought, no, if around that time they estimated that people of the 2020s wouldn't be listening to music critically, they'd be watching movies in the theater with the feelies, according to them, an Aldous Huxley term, I guess, from his book, meaning that people were more enthralled with the movie theater experience. Besides sight and sound, we were feeling things, I guess smells and touch and things. Their visualization of what the future theater was like was going to be something where we were just enthralled with that more so than music. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I did not see the article yet about what they envisioned for the 2060s, so I'll have to dig that up. But in any case, quite an interesting time, and I get a lot of fun out of reading the old articles and seeing the advertisements, from this era of audio gear. So I'll give you some up close shots of this, and then after that, I'm going to come back and we'll talk about some of the unique features that were available at during this time frame and what they were used for. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the time frame again. So this is the early 60s and right after the advent of stereo. So there were features that were provided on these units where it was accommodating people that were, still had a foot in the door of mono and were moving into stereo. So I'm going to show you a picture of the front panel here so you can see what it looks like. This is from the manual, so you can see what some of the functions are. But what I wanted to talk about first is the input selector here. And so, as you can see, it starts out with what we now typically talk about phono 1 and phono 2, but this was mag 1 and mag 2, so mag cartridge, magnetic cartridge. So basically a phono 1 and a phono 2. But in addition to that, they were also set up to be used as mono. So you could switch them, turn it off from on the next switch over from monophono and then into stereo. So you were constantly sort of going back and forth. If you had records, of course, you had records. If you were an audiophile for years, you had mono records at this time. And so you needed a way to make sure you could still play them. So this was a backward compatibility for folks that still had mono records and then were moving into stereo. So you had multiple selections here. The other thing, and I'll get to it as well, but tuners, also you had to understand the complexity of how was your tuner coming in from your FM station. Were you sharing, one channel was AM and the other channel was FM? Did you have true stereo? So you sort of had to understand all of that different technology and how to set up your stereo here to listen to it appropriately. One of the other things that's very common, and this is also a feature I see very common on McIntosh units way into the 70s. If you look on the mode selector here, you'll see there's mono, and then there's reverse, and then there's stereo. I'm not sure why it's in that order. In my head, it would have been first stereo and then reverse. But anyway, so reverse was simply a swapping of the stereo channels. So if you normally have a stereo channels on what we might think of the left and the right, but back in those days, a lot of people, the stereo hi-fi enthusiasts, they were considered folks who listened to sort of orchestral music. And when you're going to listen to an orchestra, they're set up a certain way, where the strings are on the left. And so naturally their thinking is when they hear the music, they want to hear the strings coming out of the left speaker. But when records were being cut, sometimes they were cut oppositely, and then those were reversed. So instead of having to swap your speaker wires around, you had a switch, and you could just switch those back and forth so that they were in the appropriate location. So, quite an interesting feature. And that I've noticed was available on McIntosh units throughout the entire 70s, I'm pretty sure. So they carried that feature on for quite some time. I don't know when it went away completely. And then you have an A and B selection here, as it says A for FM broadcast and then B for AM broadcast. So just, things that were interesting that the consumer, the hi-fi enthusiast had to deal with, back in that era. So quite interesting. The other thing that I found kind of cool for this particular one too is this switch here right next to the master volume, the dimension and balance. And so this was a dual switch, and it was the ability to sort of fine tune in a little bit the stereo separation. So you could center it and make it even, or you could move it one way or the other. I assume that maybe that was if you were having a stronger or weaker signal perhaps in your AM and FM. I don't know, but they were certainly trying to give you all of the flexibility possible to make it the best stereo separation, I guess, and the best experience possible when you're listening to your broadcasts or whatever your media is. So I think they were trying to accommodate all the variability of the media and the broadcast coming in. So a lot of flexibility they were trying to build into the units. So I think that's quite cool. Now I'm gonna give you a rear shot now because I wanted to talk about the connections of speakers, which was also a little bit confusing back then, and I think it's still confusing today. If you get one of these and you need to connect your speakers, you might look at this and go, "What the heck?" So looking at the picture, the first thing, if you're looking at the backside, and this is what they show in the diagram, is instead of looking at it from top down, but the very back, you'll see that there is the left channel. And when you see the left speakers, there's two connections there, which is what we typically are used to seeing. But to the right, and this is what you'll see on like monoblock amps and things, you'll see this on tube amps, this wire here. Now on most of the time, you would connect your positive to the ohms setting of the speakers. So you're matching your sensitivity or your ohms for your impedance for the speaker. And you do that physically on a lot of them. You'll take your right positive side, connect it to the appropriate ohms. But in this case, you're actually going to set that by connecting this little wire. It comes out of the top of the unit and it comes down and you connect it to the 4, 8, or 16 ohm tap here. That's where you do the left channel. But when you're on the top, you do it like I was mentioning. You actually set your common or your ground to one connection, and then based on the impedance of your speaker, you connect it to the 4, 8, or 16 tap there to match that. So why that was necessary, I honestly don't know, but in this case, if you do have this unit or one similar, just note that it's a little bit different connecting the left and the right speaker to get them matched. Now the other interesting thing on units of this era, and I think it was primarily for television, I believe. I could be wrong. I don't know the usage of the center speaker, but the center speaker tap is very common. So this was something that you see on a lot. I should do some research and see if I can figure out what most people used it for, but it was very common to have a center channel speaker, and obviously I'm sure that was blending left and right. It was mono, blending left and right channels together, but still you had that ability. Now that's different, of course, from a center channel in a home theater today, but it was very common to have that. Perhaps you could use it, I assume, as moving it to another room and having a remote speaker perhaps, or maybe it was used in the television room for that, and then you had your stereo room. I don't know. I think they were. It was just another, flexibility here that they offered in these units. So I think it's kind of cool. All right. Well, I think that's kind of my overall summary. I wanted to end it with a little bit of a discussion about how tube amps sound. Not so much how this particular amp sounds, but tube amplification in general. A lot of people ask oftentimes, I wish you would have talked about the sound. Well, I don't like to talk about individual units because there are too many variables. Mine may not sound exactly like yours, and I think that's especially true when it comes to tube gear. You can change the tubes and have a different, slightly different sound. There are some folks who advocate Muller tubes are better than Ampex tubes, for example. So there's some changes there and some variability. But in general, I like the way tube amplification, what we say is, has a warmth to it. And I very much get that when I'm using my tube gear, which I like to use mostly in the winter. They do put out a lot of heat, so I tend to listen to them in the winter months. So when I do listen to them, I have a system set up and I like to listen to period correct music. Just me. Doesn't mean that you can't play modern music or rock music or anything that you like. Any genre will certainly play on any tube amplification. It's just because I have mostly very vintage tube gear, and it's a nostalgia for me a bit. And so I tend to play, the jazz and the Rat Pack, that kind of stuff. But I do feel it and hear a difference in I'll say, that warmth, that smoothness. It sort of levels out the edges or smooths out the edges a little bit. As you become more clinically clean, I think, in the signal, there's a bit of I'll say, rough edges around. They can be a little raspy, a little too clear sometimes. And I think it's rather enjoyable on tube gear. So that's the way I tend to think about it. I do have a lot of tube gear, and could I say that there are nuances between them? Well, certainly. They have different tubes in them. They're different topologies, different circuitry. Some are single-ended, some are pentoed, etc. There's different types of amplification as well. So a lot of variables, but they all have that sort of warmth in common, and that's the way I tend to look at it. So thank you guys for tuning in. If you don't want to miss that next episode, make sure you hit subscribe, and we'll see you next time.